Hello and welcome to Game and Read. My name is Peter.
And I'm Erin.
And we are here to complete our second pairing of this new series of our podcast. We are talking about Murderous Masquerades. More specifically, Erin, what are we talking about this week?
Our game is the Sexy Brutale, and our book is the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. This week, we are going into our pairing discussion. So in the past, we have talked in depth about each thing, the book and the game, but today we're bringing it all together, talking about how they interact with each other, common themes, not common themes, and all of the above.
Yes, we are not doing any immediate recap of anything, so go back to our previous episodes, go read it and play it, and check it out yourself. We're not doing all that extra research for you. You can figure out how much you need to know going into this. But, Erin, where are we starting off? I am super stoked to talk about this pairing, mostly because I have a conspiracy theory about possible copyright infringement and or a connected universe.
Excellent.
Okay, where are we starting?
Let's start with the setting.
Okay.
So the Sexy Brutale is a casino.
Yes.
Except that it is also a mansion.
It's a mansion casino.
It's a mansion casino.
It's like the Cafe Disco. It's both things.
I don't know what the Cafe Disco
sorry.
is.
That's from The Office.
Oh, I maybe should know that. Anyway.
It's okay. Michael Scott had that extra room in the building, and then he decided to, make the Cafe Disco. It's two things. He wants it to both have the feel of a cafe and a disco. I want this to feel like a stately mansion, but also have high-stakes baccarat.
Excellent. I don't know what baccarat is either.
Honestly, I'm not sure myself. But the setting, what do these have in common in your mind, and what sort of meaning are you getting out of putting those two together?
When I think about setting for both of these things, this game and this book, what immediately comes to my attention is two things. First, they're both in these manors. In the Sexy Brutale, we have this casino mansion, right? It is the home of Lucas, and it has been transformed, and it's this big rambling mansion. Is that a way people describe houses?
There are many interconnected corridors, strange rooms. Everything was kind of added on top of each other. A little Winchester mansion-y, kind of an ongoing mansion just built on top of itself.
And in the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, Blackheath Manor is our setting, and it evokes a lot of those same mansion, big, huge, you don't really know where everything leads, you get lost. It's just this sort of massive mansion situation. So that is a very sort of superficial similarity between the two, is that they do both take place in these very large mansion-type environments.
Going off of that, though, you do learn the layout of both a lot more as you go through each piece. Definitely more so in the Sexy Brutale, where they have a much more intricate map system than a lot of games, because it is a map, but also a time map. So as you get information about where certain characters are and different movements, it will be tracked on your map, and you can fast forward through the day. So if you're looking like, where does this person go between these 2 hours? If you've observed it previously, you can find that information just in your menu. Whereas in the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, you are on this very large country estate. They don't go into too much depth of each individual detail, but there are a lot of places you kind of see over and over again as you go through the different days.
Right, depending on who your host is, you could be in the same rooms at different times in the day. So you know that at 11 o'clock, there's not a note in this corner on this shelf or wherever the note is pinned up. But when you're in a different host body and you're in that same exact room 3 hours later, there's a difference. That note is there that leads you to a piece of the puzzle, another clue. So it definitely has a similar repetitiveness and just like the physical environment and where these things are taking place. And the environment is really important in both stories. The whole casino mansion is really pivotal when you figure out that this is Lucas's home, and everything. We'll get into this a lot more, but everything is tied to this particular place. And at Blackheath Manor, there's a lot of significance in it taking place in this particular location.
Going off of that, they are also both aristocratic environments that we are going into. I would say the world of 7.5 Deaths is much more strict about that interpretation. If you're at all familiar with kind of the concept of upstairs, downstairs dramas, a la, say, Downton Abbey, and all of the more upper crusty, generally British tends to be where it is, where there's kind of the drama going on with the main family, as well as an extended drama with the servants of the home, the butlers, the everything. That plays in a lot more with 7.5 Deaths. However, in the Sexy Brutale, you are dealing with these strange butlers all wearing masks who are the ones actually committing the murders as you go through it. And while you eventually find out they're all kind of figments of this imagination, it is interesting to see the different takes that these like little murderous characters that all look alike kind of have. They definitely act as though they're put upon servants who are just kind of taking revenge, but that ends up not actually being the case.
And the way some of the guests in the Sexy Brutale treat the servants, it definitely gives those upstairs downstairs vibes. There's one point in particular when, I'm not going to remember his name. He's in a wheelchair. He's the guy in the wheelchair.
Yeah, he's the architect of the manor itself.
So he encounters one of the servant bodies as he's crossing this hallway, whatever. And the interaction is such a upstairs, downstairs, like, I am a guest. I am high class. I am an aristocrat. You serve me. You listen to me. You don't get to have an opinion. And it's just a really interesting dynamic that these servants are the murderers, because they are definitely seen as servants, I would say. I would argue that and every time you encounter a servant in the Sexy Brutale, it's very clear that they're servants, and they are able to get the guests where they need them to be because of that servant status.
Right. I'm just realizing now that both of these books kind of use the servants of both of these settings as more tools than characters themselves. And while there are more established characters in the 7.5 Deaths who are in the servant class, oftentimes when he only embodies one. He only embodies the butler, yes?
Yes, that's the only servant. Everyone else is a guest.
Yes, everyone else is a guest. But when Aiden is embodying the servant, like all the servants that take place in there kind of fall into much more mundane tropes than the upstairs folk, and going back to Sexy Brutale, you have the butlers, the servants, all following the specific orders. They aren't just killing willy-nilly. They all have specific plans to do at specific times and specific exact ways according to a plan. They don't really have any form of agency, similar to 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which I feel like is a point of lacking in how these two pieces were written, in that they didn't give more characterization to these butlers and these servants, and more just made it more, they are tools of the murder, they are tools of the plot. All the crazy twists come from the actual guests of both manors rather than the servant class, even when both occasionally have minor comments on kind of class divides.
And in both, there is this sort of general animosity between the guests and the servants, but you're right, you don't get enough character development of the servants to know why there's this hatred, except to assume it's because one group is wealthier than the other, right? Like one group has power over the other group, which is really shitty. Like I would have loved in both situations for there to be, even if it was one or two servants who had more character development, and the reason there was this like mutual hatred was because of a character aspect or a character's actions, and not just their class as the help.
There is a little bit on that, in that there are several people who are treated differently in 7.5 Deaths because of how they treat the servants. There is the one host who is known for being both an abuser and assaulter of women, and it's definitely known to like steer clear of that guy and yada yada yada. But it's only through their cruelty or their occasional kindness that there's any context for how the servants choose to treat their wards, their bosses, masters. That term's weird, so I was just like, the people they're serving. And there's not a lot of personal drive, and I guess I don't know much about servants, but I feel like that's kind of a trope of upstairs downstairs fiction, but I don't know enough of those to really say one way or the other. It just kind of struck me as like, oh, that's a little weird. They aren't people, which I guess is kind of the point, but still off-putting.
Absolutely.
At least from a literary standpoint, because they are actually people. Even if it's like, oh yeah, that's the point. They aren't seen as people. It's like, yeah, but they are people. They still have thoughts.
And they have access to information that guess the upstairs doesn't have, right? Or downstairs. Which one is which?
Downstairs is the servants, because they're down in like the kitchens and stuff. But they do have access to information. They even touch on that in 7.5 Deaths. Like, one of the main people who helps drive things, because he's not a host body at all, is Ravencourt's servant. I'm blanking on his name. Ravencourt's servant.
Can't remember.
Yeah, I know. It's been a while now, so all the characters are slowly escaping from me. But he is one of the main drivers of a lot of the things that happen at the behest of Aiden in the different host bodies. But yeah, we don't get any scenes with him because we're always just tracking Aiden, which I guess is the point of view of it. But it's just like, he's making a lot of stuff happen.
Yeah, it just feels like a missed opportunity, particularly in the 7.5 Deaths. I think it would have given a more rich and a deeper story if the servants had more of that actual character development and personality. I can feel it, the ghost of you. Since you have left me, I won't be without. Tonight in the morning and tequila at noon. Oh, you have brought me tonight in the morning and tequila at noon. Moving to the guests. So we've talked sort of about that relationship, but what I find super interesting and super striking is that in both of these stories, the guests are a very particular group gathered for such a specific reason. In the Sexy Brutale, it is the group of people who are like dear friends and regulars, and they all died in the fire.
It's the annual masquerade party, but it's a smaller group than normal this year because there's only 9 of them.
Right. And then in the 7.5 Deaths, the people who are at Blackheath Manor when Evelyn is killed are the people who are at Blackheath Manor for their annual masquerade ball.
No, they hadn't done them in a long time because nobody liked going to Blackheath.
Right, but all of those people were there
19 years
prior for the annual ball.
Right.
When Evelyn's brother was killed.
Yes.
So both of these groups are people. Thomas Hardcastle. Both of these groups of people are very intentionally located in these two spaces, and both sort of puppet masters in Lucas on the Sexy Brutale, and I guess technically like the senior Hardcastles in the book, sort of.
Yeah, it's really unclear what their final plan was, where I guess they were trying to, because they knew who the culprit was. They knew it was Evelyn. I guess they just recently found out. and then they were still making all this stuff happen instead of just finding another way to dispatch her. It seems like a really poor plan on the senior Hardcastle side of it all.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. No, it's like, were you trying to get rid of actual Evelyn, but then you all just got yourselves killed? This is all a big mess.
I do think what is interesting about having these groups of people sort of intentionally reconvened, is that it is this reminder to the reader or the player, or this indication that there is past history that we don't know. And it is not helped by the fact that we have unreliable narrators. We're getting unreliable sort of perspectives in both game and book. Aiden Bishop doesn't know what is going on from the reader's point of view. Like, he's figuring it out. So you sort of have to, you're figuring out and learning things along with him. Who are these people? Why are they here? What do they know? What do you know? And it's the same in the Sexy Brutale. Who is Lafcadio? There's obviously history. What is the history? You learn as the character. You learn as you play or read through it. But there's that inkling of, something important has happened with this group of people.
Right. Would you say they count as truly unreliable narrators, though? Because nothing they say is untrue.
Okay.
And maybe I'm misunderstanding I would say they're more ignorant.
Maybe. I guess I'm using... Okay, so unreliable narrator is mostly used in like a Gone Girl context.
Right.
Like, you can't trust what the narrator is saying.
Is that because they're being misleading or because they don't have full information?
I think it can be both.
Okay.
I personally use unreliable narrator and I think a broader context of you don't, as the reader or as the player in the game's case, you can't make a correct conclusion until the end, because there are things that the narrator is not telling you, whether they forgot or they're intentionally withholding it, or something just hasn't been revealed. That reveal aspect, that, I mean, if you think about Evelyn Hardcastle, Aiden had amnesia sort of, but it took the entire book for us to learn that it was really a prison, mind prison.
So when you're talking about unreliable narrator, do you consider it more the unreliable point of view rather than the character specifically?
Yes.
Okay, because I think in my head I always ascribe it to whoever, like an unreliable protagonist.
Oh, I consider an unreliable perspective where you think that you think and then something is revealed, often by the narrator or in conjunction with the narrator.
So kind of like not necessarily full on Fight Clubby, because I know Fight Club is obviously unreliable narrator, but it's also unreliable protagonist, in which he is effectively pulling his own strings. Spoiler alert for Fight Club, whatever. I mean, I'm not saying more than that. But you're talking more the point of view and more how the author writes it rather than how the author writes a specific character.
Right. I'm thinking...
I think I just had kind of the wrong lines crossed for what you meant by narrator.
And I think that in the Sexy Brutale, what is so interesting about the character of Lafcadio is that it is so obvious that everyone knows him. He's a trusted figure. People call him by name. Once they realize it's him, they're very friendly. And so there's this aspect of, something. Like, that there's this history, but because you are controlling Lafcadio and you have that perspective, you don't get it until the end, right? Like, you don't get it until that is revealed to you, the player. It's not necessarily revealed to you, the character, but as the player, you don't have that information.
Right. So coming back to this, what do you think these two benefit from having that unreliable narrator system put in place for telling their narrative? What do you think that brings to the table and brings to each other?
To me, I think it's a much more interesting story. if I know that I don't have all the pieces of information, if I know that there's something out there that I have to figure out or that eventually it's going to be revealed to me, that just gives me, I love the aspect of solving the mystery. Like, what is it? And this unreliable perspective, this indication of past info that's really important, but that I don't know, makes it a little more challenging and a little more interesting. I think in relation to each other, the game and the book both demonstrate how a perspective can be reliable in that it's true, right? Lafcadio moves through the mansion and interacts with people in a way that's true. You know, you figure that people, like, when people recognize Lafcadio, like, you're not doubtful that they recognize him. And in Evelyn Hardcastle, it's a little bit of a twist on it because Aiden Bishop doesn't remember, doesn't know, and you're sort of learning along with Aiden, which I think is the key difference between these two, is that I get the impression Lafcadio knows what's going on. The character, not you the player, but the character knows what this is. He knows the song and dance. He knows what he's supposed to do. He knows who these people are and the fate that, comes to them. And then in Evelyn Hardcastle, on a meta level, Aiden knows, right? And we get to that point at the end of the book. But as a character, Aiden doesn't know. Aiden is bouncing between these host bodies. He's trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Who are these people? Like, what am I doing here? And so I think that is that key difference, and that Aiden is just, you're figuring it out with Aiden, but Lafcadio knows. And so you are trying to figure it out with Lafcadio versus sort of like this team situation where, like, you're in it with Aiden. What do you think about that sort of withheld information and unreliable perspective aspect of these two?
I would say it's a very handy device for setting up the twists, turns, and gradual release of information that keeps somebody engaged throughout the whole story. And I'd say, while I considered 7.5 Deaths to be a little long in the tooth, there were a few periods where it got a little dry and not that interesting, especially in kind of the first third. It did know how to release information at pretty good moments to keep you going. Not quite perfect, but they were like, oh, here's a kind of a minor twist, here's a half twist, here's the full twist, here's the kind of backwards twist back to this point. And it does a very good job of hitting those marks until the end. It's kind of like, if you're writing something comedic, you want to have a joke every so often. And if you're writing a mystery novel, it's like you want to have some type of twist every so often that then lead to the final twist, because that way it's not Fight Club where there's the one big twist. I'm going to just keep picking on Fight Club, apparently. It is a larger amount of smaller twists that lead to a more interesting story that can be revisited in a different way. Say, when you do have those films that are just one big twist, your Fight Club, or films, books, whatever, that have that one big twist, whether it be, like Fight Club, Sixth Sense, things of that nature, where it's like, it was this the whole time, and that's the one thing, it can be not quite as interesting. So I do really appreciate the unreliable narrator as a means of getting those smaller points, keeping you engaged throughout.
Both the book and the game have these sort of guiding figures. In the Sexy Brutale, we have the red, bloody, leaking woman.
I think she's just referred to as the Red Woman.
Okay, well, I imagine her as profusely bleeding.
She is both guiding and a hidden figure. She
Correct.
got us to the moon.
Sure. And in the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, we have the person wearing a plague doctor mask.
There you go. Plague doctor mask guy.
So what are your thoughts of the Red Woman, the plague doctor mask man, and how those two guide these stories?
Well, in my continuing not yet finalized theory in which these are both in the same universe, They are the prison wardens and the referees of the game we are currently playing.
What game are we playing?
The game of solving the murder / solving an old murder to get yourself out of a weird, hellish reality.
Cool.
Anyway, the red woman in the Sexy Brutale is a much more caring figure. She definitely comes off as a more sympathetic person. She wakes you up at the beginning. She imbues you with your initial powers and helps guide you along the way and is distinctly on your side.
Oh, yeah. Whenever she pops up, it's specifically to, like, give you a hint or point you in a direction you need to go. And, like, it's never trickstery or misleading.
Right. She also exists outside of normal reality in that she only appears in and out when she wants to. She doesn't necessarily exist in a physical form so much as a kind of more spectral form and kind of blinks in and out of existence. Alternatively, we have the Plague Mask Doctor from the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, who sets himself up as definitely as kind of a guiding voice at the beginning. It's unclear who he is. And then by the last third, you are fully aware he is kind of the referee of this game. He tells you what the stakes are. He says, you're trying to solve this murder. If you do, you get out of Blackheath Manor. If you don't, you're stuck here and you keep reliving these days.
He is sort of on Aiden's side, though. Like, when he's interacting with the plague doctor guy, like, there's some distinct, like, finger on the scale towards Aiden behaviors and things that this guy does.
Right, and by the end, he's very explicit as to why that is. It's because he doesn't see Aiden as somebody who should still be in here. Aiden came in here willingly. He didn't actually commit any sort of crime or offense. And he wants to see him get released before either of the other two people trapped in the Blackheath time loop.
I do love that when before Aiden really realizes who Anna is, Aiden wants him and Anna to make it out together. Like, they want to both win. And the plague doctor guy is like, wait a second, no, like, you can't, that's not the deal. Only one person can do it. And it's like he's on Aiden's side, but to the point where he can't be on Anna's side. And you learn like terrorist Anna, right, is like a criminal. But it's just interesting that the plague doctor guy is on Aiden's side, but only up to a point.
And I think that's because he sees himself as a person who is actually following the rules. He gets accused a lot by both other people playing the game and a different plague mask doctor, who is also a separate referee, of going outside of his bounds. And he's like, no, I'm going to the letter of the law. I can do these things. Yes, it might help him a little, but that's fine. I'm not breaking the rules. Fuck you. That's kind of his perspective on this. He's trying to make something actually happen, but he's not going to do anything that he thinks is outside of his job.
He's like a weird, not quite vigilante, but also not quite like doing what is laid out. He definitely is pushing the bounds of what his job entails.
I'm trying to think of a good, not necessarily analogy, but a good comparison to something. It's like if he was a police officer, he would just be like, hey, don't do this and don't let me see you, and it's technically not a crime, right? Ha ha.
He's an RA. He's an RA.
He's a permissive RA.
Correct.
Not everyone had as permissive RAs as we had.
Okay, well, he's a Hendrix College RA.
Yes. He's like, I know what you're up to, but if I don't see it, it's all good, man. It's all good. Have a good time. Stay safe.
Whereas the red woman is...
really want you to get out of here. Just try your best. Get out of here.
The red woman is like very distinctly on Lafcadio's side, but is all and like guiding, like directly guiding.
She's also not interacting with the opposing parties, whereas the Plague Mask Doctor is.
And in the Sexy Brutale, eventually you get to Gold Mask Guy, who is this other... He's not a ref. I mean, I think of the red woman and the Gold Mask Guy as like the angel and the devil on your shoulder, right? Whereas in Evelyn Hardcastle, the Plague Mask people...
Is both shoulders.
Exactly.
And he's telling you the same thing. He's like, this is both good and bad.
Exactly. Whereas like it's much more of a dichotomy in the Sexy Brutale. There's a lot less gray.
He is a man of contrasts. Moving on from there, I think these are important figures because in this world where we already talked about the unreliable narrator, the unreliable setting, the twisty turn of having to relive things over and over again, it's nice to have someone be like, hold on, let me step out here. I know exactly what's going on, and I'm going to give you bits and pieces of information as we progress to make it a little bit easier. They are kind of the safety valve on the unreliable narrator where they're like, is this too confusing? Let's have him come in for a sec. Tell him what's going on, just a little bit.
And they, back to that, like, release of information that we were talking about with the unreliable perspectives, they give you that information, like, they're part of that safety valve, right? That release of information when you really need it. And I think it is a nice character to have to get you over the hump. There are a couple times where in the game in particular, I feel like the Red Woman came about at really important times when Aaron, the player, was like, I don't know what we do now. I don't understand what is supposed to happen. And then she like conveniently pops up and is like, hey, go to this place. Go to this room. Now, I will say the time that happened, we went on a wild goose chase and tracked down invitations, which are not required. But either way, it did eventually. But then she popped up again and was like, go to this place. We're like, oh, so there is something other than the invitations there. Cool. And so they function as this like sort of like a cheat, not a cheat system, but the hint system, right? Like, I need a hint. Help me out here.
Yes. And I'm sure the design goal was to put her in at the exact right moments that you would need her to guide you to the next challenge. And if I were to hazard a guess, I imagine they designed a lot of these individual killings that you're solving kind of individually because they aren't commingling in how you solve them. You solve them one by one, and they're mostly taking part in different areas of the manor. And so I think they probably were like, let's come up with all these good ideas for these different kind of murder scenarios we can have you solve. And then in between each one, you're going to be visited by this lady. She's going to kind of say like, hey, go check this out. This is who you're on to next. Go over there. Just as kind of like the next episode, which may not be the most naturalistic thing to do, but when you make it a character who's actively there and on your side and gets developed and has an identity because she's actually the ghost of Eleanor, your dead wife, it's less cheap. It's a little bit better.
I would much rather have her as a character, even if it isn't the most sort of natural, than a cut scene that says, chapter 4.
Next mission.
Exactly, right? Like, I think by putting it in a character, it's a much more interesting way to move you along. And I think that's the same in the book. Like, the Plague Mask guy helps move things along in a way that, like, might not be the most interesting, but it's better than the alternative, right? Which is just either like a clean break or some like, oh, and then Aiden remembered this thing, which is far less interesting, I think, as a way to get there.
And the real difference between the two as characters is that the Plague Mask Doctor isn't always obviously on Aiden's side. There are times where Aiden has to question whether or not the Plague Doctor is real, in the fact that he's not a player in the game. He's not a normal person. He's this kind of third party. There are times where he sees the Plague Doctor talking to one of the other players and goes, and he thinks he's suddenly trying to work against him or screw him over in some way. And that's something you don't get on the Sexy Brutale. Eleanor is the Red Woman's always on your side. And so there is kind of a difference there in that one, puts his hands on the scales, but you're not always sure if he's going to take it off. And the other one is just always on your side.
And in the Sexy Brutale, I think you have Gold Mask, who's on the opposite, who's against you in your current mission, right? Like, you even get the option at the end. Do you go with Eleanor, Red Woman, forgive yourself? Do you go with Gold Mask, continue to live the nightmare? And so the two of them are separate and distinct and very clear about their intentions, whereas the Plague Doctor is sort of both of them mushed together, and you don't know when he's the Red Woman and when he's the Gold Mask and when he's in between. And it's just more complex because he's only one character versus these two very clear these clear representations of on your side, not on your side.
Oh, but you came along with that crystalline smile, and now I'm a fool for you. One look and I forget how to walk. One smile, though I can't talk.
In both of these games, you develop as you interact with new characters. You gain new abilities in the Sexy Brutale. You literally embody new people in 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, and that develops the story kind of in a continuous path by interacting with these different hosts and these different powers that you get. Aaron, what are some of the similarities that you saw between these two, as well as some of the differences? Because I think this is one of the points in which they do actually separate here. This is one of the things where I'm like, oh, they're not perfectly identical. They're actually quite different right here.
They absolutely are. So so I think the biggest difference is characteristic versus embodiment. Sexy Brutale, you get the power of the people as you save them. And it's not until you save them that you get their mask and you get their power, and then you can use the power whenever you want in the world. The 7.5 Deaths is totally different. There's no choice. And when you're embodying these people, it's sort of just, you wake up and you're this person, and then you wake up and you're this next person, and then you wake up and you're this next person. And when Aiden tries to cheat the system, it burns him. And so you just don't have the control over who you are in the Sexy Brutale. And I think that is this pivotal difference between the two, because in the Sexy Brutale, if you couldn't control when you used your powers, right? If you just had them, and sometimes you could use this one, and sometimes you couldn't, and then you could use that one, and sometimes you couldn't. I think it doesn't make for great gameplay. I think it'd be really frustrating to be like, well, wait, 10 minutes ago I could, pick locks. Why can't I pick locks now? Whereas in Evelyn Hardcastle, I think it works really well to have that lack of control, because it adds that element of unpredictability, and it heightens the tension, because you only have one day, right? And you have limited hours in each body. And if bodies are being killed, right, because that's what's happening, Daniel is trying to kill bodies, hosts, your rope is short, right? Like, your time is so limited. And I think it gives you this sense of urgency and this sense of panic, because you have this sense of urgency, but you can't really do anything. Like, all you can do is try and solve the murder. You can't delay the inevitable of the end of the day. So I think that is just I agree, the biggest point of divergence with the two, and that it's so interesting that they both give you sort of these different, I would call in Evelyn Hardcastle to some extent power. It's not supernatural powers, but it is different bodies and different personalities and connections and relations.
It's the power that comes from being a totally different persona rather than a specific ability.
Exactly. But they both give you these different powers, but they handle them such different ways in each situation.
All right. Now that you've talked about all that, if you, as Aaron Hanneman, as just a normal person, were stuck in a weird time prison, would you rather get the abilities of people you rescue, or become different people to see things through their perspective?
I would absolutely want the abilities of people I rescue.
Yeah, why is that?
I am a control freak. Okay? That's not
okay.
True. I don't think I'm a control freak. I do like being in control. No, I like knowing.
Because you're bad at role playing.
I am not. Sort of. So
Specifically tabletop role playing.
I
Just for clarity.
I think
You're not actually bad at it. You just don't want to do it in case they ever get stuck in a murder time loop.
I think that a big reason that I would prefer the abilities of people I rescue is that, and this is a strength for Evelyn Hardcastle, it must be so disorienting to like wake up in random bodies and you don't know who they are. You don't know the history with other guests. You don't know what you don't know, right? Like it's just so sudden, where I like the idea that you are who you are and you just gain more power.
Gotcha. I would say who of all people in the world has had the experience of the feeling of waking up in a totally new body? I guess people with amnesia, people who maybe wake up from a coma and it's been a while, and I don't know who else, because that's not like a thing you can ever experience, of being like, I'm in a totally different body.
And I have no memories. Yeah, no.
Or just, just a total, like, what's the perception of being in someone else's skin? Because that's something that Aiden goes through. He perceives things differently, and that's not something we as humans can actually conceive of.
What is so funny, though, is that, I mean, one of the, I feel like, so cliche, but walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
It's
right?
impossible.
It's impossible. And when you're confronted with it.
But then you would really know what it's like to sing the blues.
Is that the next line of the song?
I
Is there a
believe so.
song?
Yeah.
Oh, I just know the phrase.
Then you really know what it's like to sing the blues.
Anyway, you can't literally do that, right? Like, you cannot literally walk in someone else's life and know what they're going through. And yet, Stuart Turton takes that phrase essentially and brings it to this book. And like, that's the whole point, is that Aiden is literally walking in other people's skins and literally experiencing the world as these people experience the world. And I think that both the Sexy Brutale and the 7.5 Deaths really use the best method for the story. Like I said, it wouldn't be good gameplay if you kept waking up, quote unquote, in random bodies and you had to figure out who you were. Like, maybe it's interesting, but it's also, I think, not an interesting story to just acquire powers as you rescue people. Maybe there is a story out there in which that is a really interesting device, but I think for this particular setting, they both really handled that multiple perspectives, multiple abilities in a really nice and fitting way.
Well, and they both lean into what works well for their medium. The best thing, one of the good things about books is changing perspective, changing point of view, things like that. That's why, there are many books that have different characters and different point of views to give you the different perspectives on everything. And that's something you can do really well in a written text. Video games, perspective change isn't always obvious. Obviously, you could be looking at a different character or have a different angle on things, perhaps. But video games are really about what verbs you can do. How can you interact with it? And Sexy Brutale does a good job of expanding the selection of verbs you get as you go. You can now do this. You can now do this. Whereas right at the beginning, you could do one of these 4 things. Well, now you're up to 10 things you can do depending on what sort of situation you're in. And so that's why I think those work. They wouldn't work in the opposite one's situation, but work really well in their own. But that's the biggest differentiation point I've seen in these bookend games so far. And so that's why I want to touch on it. Anything else on that one?
I don't think so.
All right.
I want to hear your...
Well, we got one more thing before you get to my unified theory.
What do we have left?
Timing.
Oh, yeah. How could I forget? I feel like we've been talking about timing through this whole conversation, but we should talk specifically about it. That's fair. The timing is obviously so key in both of these stories.
I would say doubly so in Sexy Brutale, because once again, it's about verbing. It's about doing the actions, and it's hard to perceive actions in real time when you're reading.
Yes. I do think that Evelyn Hardcastle relies on timing to move things along and to learn that information, right? Like, I go back to the note. I think it's in a barn or a shed. I don't remember where it is. Either way, at one point there's a note, and you don't know until much later. You don't realize until much later that you, Aiden, in a different body, left the note, right? So it does not to the extent that Sexy Brutale does. Again, Sexy Brutale is much more about that verbing, about that control. But Evelyn Hardcastle does use that same sort of thing.
So very similar. So while they both have unreliable narrators for story perspectives, one has reliable timing, one has unreliable timing.
Very true.
Because Sexy Brutale is very consistent. When you change stuff still stays the same. You go and solve one murder, and then you rewind time to go solve the next. That murder you just solved still happens. It doesn't autocorrect itself. You're not there multiple times. You're not actively changing the time stream per se. You're just going through and solving things individually. Whereas Evelyn Hardcastle, one of the issues I actually had with it is that things happen out of view. Things are being changed. Yeah. You don't realize they're being changed until they say that they're changed and it's already taking effect. And it's much more unreliable of when certain things happened, because as you kind of go through the stream and you start changing things along the way, it presumably changes what some of those earlier people might have done or seen, and it's not made expressly clear to you until you see the results of it. It's unreliable, where sometimes it'll just be like, oh, and this changed along the way. And it was like, when did that happen?
That's true. Evelyn Hardcastle definitely relies on an unreliable timeline in order for everything to sort of fit together.
And I think if you remapped it all out, it would make sense. But when you're reading and you're trying to kind of construct this semi-linear with time loops, it gets difficult. And so since you're not just reliving the exact same thing every day with the same things happening, things change along the way. Unless they go back and re-narrate all those parts, it can be hard to keep track. And so that is one additional difference they had with regards to how powers and different personas were acquired, as well as just the concept of time in both of these universes, because one is being narrated to you while one is you interacting with it, and we as humans can't interact with a out of time stream in that moment.
I do think that's one of the pitfalls, right, of Evelyn Hardcastle, and one of the pitfalls of relying on timing so much in a written text, or even if it's audio, right? Like, it's the story, you can't visualize it. I think you're very right about that. And like, it's hard to remember what you know and what you don't know sometimes. And I think that is a challenge of using timing. I have read other books that also rely on this sort of sense of timing. And I'd say that is a common issue, is how do you communicate what has happened as a result of meddling with the time stream? And I don't know that anyone has gotten it right in literature yet.
Or how do you even fully narrate an action that is happening in 5 seconds and giving enough detail without making it sound like it's taking 30 minutes to do the same thing?
Oh, that's a huge issue.
And film, TV, everything has that same issue where it's like, man, this 10-second countdown clock to when the bomb explodes is taking a real long time. We're having all this dialogue in between. And so I think it's just one of those things that is difficult in fiction when you're not doing it in real time.
It's funny, too, because it makes me think of when we play Dungeons and Dragons, and like a turn when everyone goes
is 6 seconds long.
6 seconds. But like when we play with our 5 people, it takes like not 10 minutes, depending on the round, though, like could take 10 minutes.
Yes.
And so this idea of like, wait, we're not doing it in real time. Whereas at least in the Sexy Brutale, like, we figured out, okay, it takes like, I don't know, 3 minutes to get from noon to, or 8 a.m. to noon, right? Like, we know how long in real time it corresponds to that time in the game time. And so it's much easier to conceptualize that. And I do think whenever you are not doing something or reading something or experiencing something in real time and yet you're needing to understand that it's real time is super challenging.
Any other notes on time?
It's time to hear the theory.
All
Give
right.
me the theory.
Peter's unified theory of the 7.5 deaths of the Sexy Brutale, or the 7.5 sexy deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. All right. Both of these stories take place in the same universe.
What?
Well, here's how it happens. There's some sort of large international semi-magical institution that is able to create time loops as a way of imprisoning and creating effectively a living hell for those who have done truly heinous crimes. A la, that is what Anna is stuck in. Annabelle, crazy terrorist lady who likes to murder people. She gets thrown in there after she's caught. Whoever the hell Daniel is, whatever he did, he's in there too. I'm sure he was a creep. Anyway, this technology exists. It is something that you can do. You can clearly come in and out of it. There's a reality going on. There's the weird warden people who are the magistrates over each kind of jail cell, as it were. And each jail cell, depending on how crazy that particular historical occurrence is, can hold like 1 to 10 people, let's say. So maybe if it was a really big thing or a more spread out area, because Blackheath Manor, while there's a lot of characters there, it's only so big of a place. So it's 3 people max who get stuck in there. Because the people get stuck in there aren't at all related to the actual crime that happened way back in the 1920s in England. All right. So in this world where this is a possibility,
Okay.
Lucas, having done all this terrible stuff and gotten away with... Well, no, he did go to jail.
He went
to just
to
normal
jail.
jail.
They talk
so
about...
that happened before this technology existed. He went to normal jail for committing this heinous crime of setting a fire and accidentally killing all of his friends and family.
Okay.
He, still wanting to repent in a very self-harm way, decided like, hey, I'm going to figure out how to either break into one of those things or make one myself.
I buy the make one himself
That seems
situation.
to be more what it is.
If we're going
he's like,
through that.
what if I created my own weird mental prison? And that's why he's eventually able to break out of it more effectively, because there's not actually a warden there.
Oh, so
it's
like...
all just like figments of his imagination and or literal ghosts. I think the Red Spectre is a literal ghost who breaks into his mental prison.
Okay, so that I don't understand, but that's okay.
Well, why would he have any other reason to break himself out of it? That's the thing. Like, that's the trigger. Because that one, she wasn't there until that one where it's like, you've done this like 500 times. Let's get you out of here, Lucas.
So you think that the Red Woman is a literal specter that has come and interfered with this situation? So
yes,
you're saying
he is the own warden himself. He is Gold Mask guy who's tormenting him.
So you're saying that Lucas has set it up as such, but how is? So you're just saying like he uses his technology to make himself both the warden and the victim?
Yes.
And then the Red Spectre is a real specter?
Yes. Because
Okay,
he wouldn't know how to program that in, because he's not going to forgive himself.
That's okay.
It takes an outside impetus to say like, hey, let's cool it.
His kid died too, right? Because she was an unborn child.
Yes, his unborn child was also killed.
So you don't think this is like a third party, like Red Woman is like a third party?
I think the Red Woman is explicitly Eleanor.
Yeah. But I'm saying, like, in this theory that we're talking about, like, could someone have programmed the Red Woman in? Like, do you think there's someone in the reality world in this theory that was like, you know what?
No, because that never comes forward.
That's fair.
And so for this to all fit perfectly, it's like once he forgives himself and gets himself out of his mind
then
prison, she's
done.
like, peace out, love you forever.
Okay, I buy that theory.
Yeah, it's not that complicated of a theory.
Actually, it makes a lot of sense.
because they're so vague in 7.5 deaths that you can imagine whatever you want. You can say this is heaven hell type scenario. This is real world but strange mind prisons. It could be like Matrixy where they get jacked in with the spinal cord lines.
Haven't seen The Matrix.
Anyway, you've seen that part of The Matrix.
I don't remember it. Anyway, so I do think that 7.5 deaths for sure alludes to the existence of multiple of these prison things.
Explicitly says there's multiple.
Right, like it explicitly says there's multiple. Like this is one of many. There's lots of criminals in this situation.
And there's a hierarchy and a rule set, which makes me think it's more of a literal thing rather than a heaven-hell thing.
And Aiden makes the choice to go in, right? Like, how would he know if it's not, like, that's where I also think it's reality, right? It's because it's like, how would Aiden know that that's where Annabelle is? And how could he make a conscious decision to go in there to torture her? Like, that feels like it has to be something tied to the real world. Like, Aiden is a real person who is still alive. Annabelle is a real person who is alive, but is in this weird situation. I buy it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you like my unified theory?
I do. I think it's so funny. I think I talked about this in the last episode, or the intro or something like that. But Stuart Turton has been asked multiple times if like he based this off of or like based it on a video game, or like was thinking about video games.
I feel like that was a pointed question considering this book came out a year after the game came out.
Well, that's what I think is so funny.
Somebody was like, "Oh, did you base this on this video game, mate?"
But
just because they're all British.
He's not Australian.
Okay.
Do they say mate in English?
I think
this
so.
This feels like a really ignorant question. I'm so sorry.
How dare you offend all those British people who may say mate?
I don't know. I've never been there.
That's true. Anyway, I think it is. I highly doubt it was actually lifted from this. There's just a lot of things in common. The fact that they both came out, game came out a year beforehand, but Stuart Turton was probably working on this book and submitting it not long after this game came out. So it's like, he already had this idea in his head somewhere. Just like, it's just lateral thinking like that. And maybe they're both basing this off something we don't actually know about, just kind of more slyly. It's just funny that these two came out so closely together and just have that many similarities. And I like that it was the game first, so that you can't be like, oh, it's just a game taken, like, because games are notorious for that, of basically just lifting, especially back in like the early thousands, where it's just like, oh, every World War II game was just Saving Private Ryan, the video game. I like that games are a little bit more original, and now maybe books are taken from games a little bit.
I know the answer to this question, but how do these fit as a pairing?
Very effectively.
Potentially.
These are two halves of a two-piece jigsaw puzzle.
What does the jigsaw puzzle reveal?
It's just a smushing of the covers of the two things, just like stuck together with just like look, they're similar.
What?
It's a very simple puzzle.
What a terrible puzzle.
It's not so much a puzzle as it is two pieces of paper next to each other.
There we go. But really, I do think that these, as it's become incredibly clear, are really good together. They have so many overlapping ideas and concepts. The parts where they differ, I think, are so appropriate. The reason that they differ fit each medium really well. Even the flaws sort of fit, right? And go in that same vein. So it definitely, it's obvious, but it's a very successful pairing.
I would say they almost fit so well together that it's hard to extrapolate, interpret more stuff from each other. Like, we need a couple more contrasts to make this a truly interesting pairing.
I agree. I actually, I'm reflecting on this conversation, and it's hard to make analysis when you're like, yeah, they both did this thing.
They both did this. They both did that.
Right. And again, the differences that they have are necessary, I think, for the mediums. Like, particularly with the perspective thing and with the timing thing. And it does feel like, I kind of feel like this was cheating because they're so similar.
Somewhat unintentional, though, because we decided to do this pairing before we had finished the game, and I had not read the book at all.
Right, I had no idea.
Because we had planned on doing it, and we were like, okay, so let's start playing this game. And you were like, oh, this is very similar. I was like, okay, cool. But we had already sat down to do this before we started playing.
Oh, yeah, no, just hearing the concepts, I was like, oh, I think these would go well together. And then as we started playing, I was like, oh, shit, these are like the same thing in so many ways. So, successful pairing.
Yeah, I would say read the book first. because then maybe you want to play like an interactive version with a different story. If you've listened to all these things and still want to read and or play it, I would say after all this, it might still be worth reading the book. It has already been, it was optioned before it was published, so it may become a TV show, miniseries, or movie sometime in the future. Maybe wait for that if you've already listened to all this and have seen all the twists and turns, unless you really sound interested now. I would say even after everything we went through, it's still a fun game to play. We didn't really spoil a lot of the actual puzzles.
No, I don't think we spoiled any of them.
So even if you know the plot, it's still a fun puzzle game, and I would still really recommend it, even if you know exactly what happens at the end.
I definitely think the game is worth playing. Aesthetics and puzzle-wise, it's fantastic. I love the visuals, even if you know what's going on. And I love most of the puzzles, I think, are really creative and interesting. The book, if you haven't already read it, I would agree with maybe wait or just don't read it because you know all the twists to it. I don't think it was a stellar book. It was certainly enjoyable, but I don't know that you're going to get...
It was capably written.
I don't know that you're going to get a ton out of it after you know all the plot twists.
That's all we have for you this week. We will be back next week with a topic-based episode where we'll be covering just a general subject in books and games. You can find us on social media and on our blog. Our blog is gameandread.wordpress.com, and you can find me on Twitter at nerdintheworld.
I am over on Instagram at A Tale of Two Shelves. You can listen to us on all your podcatchers, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the other things.
Stitcher,
SoundCloud, all those shenanigans. Our opening music was written and performed by Avery Murchison. You'll find a link to his Bandcamp down in the description.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.
Game and Read.
Pig emoji.
Oh.
Jeebus.
Okay, I gotta come up with a new Twitter handle. You made me paranoid about having my name in my Twitter handle. So, not right now, but as we move forward through this weekend, I need your help brainstorming a new name.
All right. Booktube is my life.
Fuck you. No.
Book Riot. Hanya Hanagahari.
No.
Zadie Smith.
You are just naming authors.
I know, but you should take these Twitter handles.
No, there's no way those authors don't have those Twitter handles.
I'm pretty sure there's a slight chance.
You really think so?
If they're reclusive.
Yeah, I don't think so.